I'm just not a kid anymore. I'm an adult.
Well, according to this show, you don't have to worry about those little details, Monty. Yeah, it took a little longer for what's only a 12-episode series, but I kind of need to collect my thoughts over the New Year's and then after. In that time, I ended up going over to my sister's house and had to watch the niece for a little bit. Good lord, that child's calorie intake and output. That aside, I actually did have a good time. It did give me an opportunity to realize how much this show really failed in terms of its themes and messages. Part of it was likely because they had one too many messages that either should have had less focus or had just been cut entirely with the whole environmentalist stuff. Another issue might have been the writer herself being held back by her old habits that have led to, in my opinion at least, a decline in her writing, and has even made me a little hesitant to check out her next series. And yet, I would say the most degrading factor might have been Toei's inability to decide on who their audience for the show was. As a result, it became a classic case of trying to please everyone and pleasing no one in the process. Which is a pity, because they could have had something with a series about accepting our present adulthood while still maintaining healthy ties with our youth of the past, allowing us to move towards a better future. However, it just didn't do that in my opinion, and as a result, much like the franchise in its current state, it just keeps going back to the same old bag of tricks. What exactly do I mean by that, and what could they have done to fix it? Well, let's take a look at Precure's later-ish night series, Ultima Precure. Back in March of last year, it was announced that two Precure series would be getting sequels, one being for Behold Sky, and the other being for our subject today, Ultima Precure, also known as Power of Hope Precure Full Bloom, also known as Precure 5-3. Yeah, this is another sequel to a series that, at least according to DHK polls, had a sequel that was at least on par with its original, unlike Max Heart, and even considered better by some, which it's not really.
Well, the chart said...
Regardless, as the first title suggested, it was supposed to be a show about adult Precure, which did match up well with a series where the whole main theme was exploring people's dreams for the future, that was even highlighted in the third New Stage crossover film, which makes sense as that film was written by the head writer of the original 2 series, Yoshimi Narita. With that in mind, it only really made sense to bring her back again so that she could work her magic for this show. And honestly, I thought so too. That is until I saw some of the episodes she wrote for the actual mainline Precure series at the time, Hirogaru Sky. Of the 3 episodes she wrote for that series, they range from pretty good to outright the worst episode of that whole series, and one of the worst Precure episodes I've recently seen. Though we won't really go into that episode, as we probably should save it for that series overview, and frankly, I'm willing to say there might have been some external issues that dictated that episode's writing, as it did go against her usual style. That said, the other 2 episodes that we actually want to highlight, and while marginally better than that outlier, did also highlight Narita's tendency to stick with her favorite tropes, which unfortunately include toxic relationships. Yes, she wrote 2/3 of the Battlemondo Redemption Arc episodes, and while thankfully nothing came of it, like the main thing we'll talk about, it was clear that Narita was at least trying to write a Mashiro/Battlemondo subplot, whilst ignoring the laundry list of crimes that he had committed, and should not be so easily forgiven for. But no, of course, many of her stories have to go in with the classic mindset that I can fix him, even though, really, why would you? Funniest thing is that her writing style and tendency to stick with her old tropes has drawn a lot of comparisons between her and a tokusatsu writer named Toshiki Inoue. Both have become controversial figures for some of the story choices they've made with their shows, like their overuse of comedy to the point of excess, or in particular, their romance subplots that turn these kids shows into some pretty melodramatic daytime soap operas. Though while Inoue has had a bit of a career renaissance with Avataro Sentai Dome Brothers, I don't think the same can be said for Narita, as her Hirogaru Sky episodes did end up becoming a bit of a microcosm for what we'd see in Ultima and some of the more controversial plot lines that we'll get to by the end. Going into the show itself, it actually did start off pretty promising. Nozomi achieved her dream of becoming a teacher of one of their modern classes that use iPads to help them study. Now you see, youngin, these are called books, and we didn't complain when we had to drive them all over the place back when we were young. She also went rather deep into detail about climate change, but I'm sure that won't become a big thing later. Right. Man, from there, the first actual conflict of the show was legit one of the best on the grounds that it was a very mature plot with a very relatable struggle and outcome. Nozomi tried to make it so that one of her students could stay at their school as she believed she had great potential as a dancer that she clearly wanted to pursue. However, the student's father's company had gone bankrupt, forcing them to need to move back to the countryside with his parents. Thus, Nozomi, the ever-hopeful Precure of Dreams, tried several methods to financially support them, including giving the elementary school student a scholarship, or even signing the father up for unemployment support. All of which, of course, led to dead ends, as the former would promote preferential treatment for the student, on top of needing to establish a brand new policy for the school, and the latter would likely have a ton of different little clauses that would probably dig them into a deeper financial hole. And yet Nozomi continued to push the issue even after learning that the father had divorced his wife and would therefore have to pay alimony. Thus, in the end, she not only had to face the fact that she might have pushed a few too many buttons, but also that sometimes being an adult means accepting that there are things just out of our control. Things might have seemed, and maybe even were, easier when we were kids and the world was our oyster, but not so much once we grew up. It's a very relatable theme because, as sad and cynical as it sounds, money is everything in this world, and if things just aren't working out, well, sometimes we just have to move on and adjust. Even Nozomi's student recognized this by the end, and even managed to continue her dream of becoming a dancer by establishing a new club at her little school in the boonies. Yeah, ironically, Rumi here was a bit more of the adult in this situation, as opposed to Nozomi, who had become tunnel vision to the point their actions had become more reductive than anything else. But again, she did at least get a good reality check by the end, so this could be the start of a good character arc for her, where she could learn how to cope with the stresses of adulthood, and maybe even become a better teacher in the process end. Okay, you ready, Dawes? You ready? Okay, here I come. Yeah, I really feel like I was in the minority here, but I was not excited to see the return of Pure Dream, especially not this early into the series. I think what really bothered me was how much of a massive tonal shift this was from the first episode, and even the second episode, until that literally accursed flower bloomed. Sure, the show still had some cheesy bits, and even called back to their original kids show, which is fine as a little nostalgia isn't going to ruin a show, hint hint. But going back to the old superheroing thing, especially after Nozomi had a few epiphanies about her limitations as an adult, just feels counterintuitive to any sort of message about adulthood that they could have told. After all, why bother worrying about those more adult issues that usually don't have any clear or straightforward answers, when instead you could just go back to those more carefree and literally magical days of childhood and just beat it into the pavement. Basically what they're saying is that if life gives you lemons, then screw making lemonade and just go back to drinking that sugary crap from when you were a kid. Now, I've heard that some people were expecting them to transform into adult versions of their Precure forms, and as we have even seen in other Magical Girl franchises, where they managed to grow up with their powers, then hell, even Toei's own Ojamaso Doremi managed to do it with their spin-off books from what I've heard. Doing it this way makes it seem like they were cutting corners by going back to these old stock animations that don't even match up with the more saturated HD colors of this show. Personally though, I had more issue with the fact that they went back to their magic in just the second episode, as it did seem like, to me at least, that they were going with a more grounded story that could have built up to some of the more traditional Magical Girl stuff, where the characters' adult and childhood could have intersected to find a solution to their problems. But alas, with a villain like this right off Captain Planet, I guess they couldn't wait to let Nozomi get rid of those troublesome little wrinkles. Belle, to be fair, is far from the worst Precure villain, at least coming out of 2023, but she is up there as one of the worst written, in my opinion at least. We'll get more into those details later. For now, I will say I think it would have been better if they had focused more on her targets being people who had succumbed to apathy rather than just people who didn't care for the environment. With apathy, they could have brought up some of the unfortunate issues and challenges that do come with growing up in an overly rigid society like Japan. In fact, looking back at the third and fourth episodes, I kind of think that's what they were going with, as those victims weren't littering, at least not from what was shown to us, and just becoming indifferent and cynical to the world around them. understandable, as one was a stressed out doctor, and the others were senior citizens who, unlike Miyuki's granny, had become outright jaded to the world around them. Stuff like that is very interesting, and does kinda speak to Japan's flawed economical structure that fails to support everyone, like medical workers and retirees. However, that, and the equally interesting episode they could have done about Kurumi working within this country's archaic work culture, were seemingly dropped. Part of it, I think, was done to integrate more of the environmentalist stuff, which in some ways I can understand, even if I'm not the biggest fan of it. That said, I'm a little less forgiving of the other reason this stuff got less focus.
But this is amazing!
Now, to be fair to the Splash Star duel, especially since some of our subscribers are big fans of them, and we want to avoid those pitchforks, I didn't find their presence all that intrusive, at least compared to another certain duel that we'll get to. But yeah, according to some interviews, the inclusion of another Precure team was seemingly penciled in early into the production, so at least in the beginning, their presence in the show flowed in kind of naturally. In fact, I'll fully admit, the first Splash Star episode featuring Mai was easily one of my favorite episodes of the show. For one, it featured the eternal best bro in Bumby, and it also had one of the more relatable conflicts in Mai being unsure if she was comfortable in her current occupation and relationship. In the case of the former, she was getting the sense that she was overqualified for it, and perhaps wanted something more stimulating that I don't think should include YouTubing, just saying. And in the case of the latter, she and her romantic partner had grown apart, and yet with her best friend getting married soon, she thought it would be kind of odd if she just broke things off. But ultimately, that very same friend in Saki made her realize that she was putting too much value in the opinions and accomplishments of others and not enough in her own. Because as it turned out, she is perfectly content with her current career in spite of it not perfectly matching up with some of her old ideals from college, and she indeed had fallen out with her boyfriend. The fact is that as we grow up, our views and interests will likely change, and while it's only natural to be slightly influenced by others, the final decision on major components in our lives will always be with ourselves, and our sometimes fickle feelings, which are nothing to be ashamed of. Yeah, I just really wanted to bring up that episode because I find it to be very relatable to pretty much anyone in their 20s who likely grew up watching Yes and or Splash Star, and it wasn't even written by Yoshimi Narita. Yeah, this episode, and the follow-up featuring Saki, were written by Isamu Murayama, and while the latter episode wasn't quite as strong, I'd argue that was more due to the overarching plot of the show starting to take over, and less to do with his writing. Admittedly, I am more saying this to at least give myself a little more hope for his sequel show in Mahotsukai 2, but the point is that after this great episode, and as we entered into the latter half of the series, things really did start to dip once Yoshimi Narita came in with some of her usual controversial writing habits. Now, truth be told, while I certainly didn't support the Koko/Nozomi ship because teacher-student, that's just a plain no-no, I also didn't outright dislike it, at least not to the degree of some of Narita's other 4 ships. Yeah, along with the aforementioned Batamonda/Masho episode she wrote for Hero Sky, there is a very unfortunate pattern in her writing involving older guys and adolescent girls. And yet, for me at least, this ship didn't exactly enter into hateful territory, as one, Koko was pretty cool. He was easily one of the most supportive fairies in this franchise, and by the end, he did become a very competent king. Which, when compared to a certain incompetent deity who probably could have been exorcised from his show and it would have been all the better for it, I didn't hate the Fairy King, and just rolled my eyes at the ship. That also wasn't too big of a soap opera that overtook its show like Happiness Charge did, in my opinion. So, guess what happened when the 5th episode rolled around and we saw the return of the king? Yeah, again, while I wasn't initially against this ship, by the end, yeah, I was kind of against it for a few reasons. One, I'm already kind of adverse to needless melodrama, which, while this was far from the worst I've seen in this franchise, it still got on my nerves. Second, unlike with its original series, it did feel intrusive to the series' main plot, especially since it was only a 12-episode show. Third, and probably most damningly, the relationship became needlessly toxic when it really didn't need to be. I mean, I did like the idea that their relationship ended up getting strained because of their respective occupations, as that is what many couples have to go through at some point. And if it doesn't work out, well, you should probably just call it off. And yet, I think because of Narita's obsession for writing these sorts of trashy relationships, we ended up with Koko admitting that he had ghosted Nozomi while still stalking her from afar.
Nope, stop talking, go to jail.
And yet, they still ended up together by the end. Yeah, again, while I still won't necessarily say I hated the ship, I did highly disapprove of it by the end, from a moral standpoint, as it is just more of Narita pushing for unhealthy relationships, and I think it also ties with some of the bigger issues of the series that especially became apparent in its latter half. That being how this franchise just seems to be unable to let go of the past. As I'm writing and recording this part of the script, All Stars F hasn't been fully released outside of a few leaks here and there. Regardless, I can say I'm looking forward to watching it, as it seems like a very powerful celebration of the franchise, because it was specifically delegated to a special movie with higher production values. Meanwhile, with this show, bringing in the first two Precure teams' first show that's supposed to be celebrating the legacy of the S5 team, feels more intrusive than anything else. Yes, I know we said that the Splash Stars weren't bad at first, but that was because they didn't transform, and instead just told a good, complementary story to this show's overarching theme of growing up, and learning how to compromise with the unfortunate and unexpected difficulties that come with growing up. But no, apparently everyone had to age regress and become Precure again, even though it far exceeded the original number of time flowers that we saw, and also they said that Kurumi needed to use a flower, even though she's a fairy who could alter her form to her liking and had no reason to lose the Blue Rose Pact and
It just don't add up!
To me, it does seem like this show, as well as the current Precure season, did get some significant rewrites to fit in a few extra elements. First, just from what we could glean to the regular eye test, it does feel like bringing the OG team was incredibly forced. Sure, they did kind of build up to it with Sanai's appearance, which also ended up taking up a good chunk of an episode that was supposed to spotlight Komachi. Yeah, aside from Kurumi, who again got no episode, Komachi actually got close to nothing. Sure, she was imparted appreciation for their talent that apparently she was lacking when writing for her next book, which, yeah, that's not much of an arc, at least compared to most of the rest of her team. Yeah, don't worry, we'll get back to Nozomi in just a bit. Still, in my opinion, I think they should have, and they probably wanted to focus more on Komachi overcoming her writer's block, but no, they also had to justify the arrival of the OGs, who showed up near the end and barely did anything. Yeah, I think you could probably cut them out entirely, and it wouldn't have made any real difference, especially Hikari, who I think got like 2 or 3 lines, making me feel kind of bad for Rie Tanaka. Maybe just stick with Genshin and Neptunia next time, lady. But yeah, it really does feel like they were nostalgia bait just for the sake of drawing up a little extra buzz for this show, never mind the fact that we never actually saw the 3 of them in their adult forms. As a result, while we got a recreation for the prototype of the All-Stars films, I'd say we kind of lost focus of what the show was advertising from the start, an adult cure show, by constantly looking back to the days of the past rather than looking forward to the future of adulthood. And to really highlight how the show ended up getting derailed, I think for the character section, we should mainly focus on just the main villainess and heroine of the show in Belle and Nozomi. We'll talk a little bit more about the rest of the cast later, but I think these two deserve special focus. Now personally, I do think the nostalgia baiting was more of a Toei call, but there also were some other conspiracy-laden forces that might have forced changes into the show. For those unfamiliar, the NHK and its associated channels are pretty much like the PBS of Japan, basically highly regulated public broadcast channels available to most households. And as the name suggests, NHK Educational is supposed to include more documentary and learning shows. As such, apparently a prerequisite to even get on the channel was that they needed to include the environmentalist messages. Thus, appropriately for this part, I think I'm just gonna break out the tinfoil. I didn't get nearly enough. So I think this mandate might have set off a bit of a chain reaction that led to a lot of script changes for, I'd argue, the worst, especially in regards to Belle's writing. I think her targets were meant to be more people succumbing to apathy and not caring about their fellow man. It would explain why the Doctor in the third episode produced a shadow even though he wasn't littering or anything. However, because the staff, and in particular the writers, weren't fully prepared to write about global warming, especially in a way that wouldn't make their corporate overlords look bad, they ended up turning Belle into an eco-terrorist, which are rightfully considered to be some of the lamest villains possible. I mean, not only do we have to deal with such cycles in real life, but they also often come off as some of the biggest hypocrites.
Why, yes, Teacher Momoa, please do tell us more about why we should build this observatory that could really benefit our economy, because it would take down a few trees, while you come to our state in your private jet, while also making some ridiculous high-budget movies that cause a lot more damage to the environment. Yeah, I didn't go see Aquaman 2, less so because of Amber Heard and more this dude.
And really, that's what Belle comes off like, a Karen who complains about the environment, and yet often is the one causing the most damage, especially with that final battle. As a result, her hypocrisy comes off more as frustrating, rather than as a villain we want to see get their comeuppance due to the preachiness of it all. If they had gone with the apathy angle, then she still would have been a hypocrite, but at least we would have been spared from the sermonizing, and it would have tied nicely with the adult theme. And after all, it's almost only natural for people to become a little more jaded to the world around us as we do become aware of the uglier sides to it. Stuff that can make you question, why bother even waking up in the morning if there's a chance someone or something is gonna screw you over and make your life a living hell? And yet, people can overcome such negative thoughts when they look towards the more positive and optimistic parts of life.
If Belle had been written with those themes in mind, which I am convinced was the original plan, then I think we could have gotten a much more effective message than what we ended up getting.
I mean, they still could have had the environmentalism stuff, as not caring about it is a form of apathy in of itself, but by letting it take over this character to the point that she started using very blanket statements that muddle any sort of message they were going for, it ironically came off more immature than many kids shows, including Precure. It also would have made her a more effective foil for the main protagonist of the show, who was kind of in dire need of a proper character arc. As we said earlier, Nozomi's whole arc kind of fell apart as soon as she put her school uniform back on, and not in the kind of fishy way that the bubble economy lady did. This led to her getting, I'd argue, the worst character arc of the show, as she failed to really highlight the theme of growing up and accepting adulthood by constantly going back to her and this franchise's golden years. And yes, while all of the Kyrs were technically guilty of this, they did kind of make up for it with their arcs by at least showing that they were still working hard at their day jobs. And even though Komachi's arc was very rushed, she at least got a renewed vigor for writing afterwards. Meanwhile, with Nozomi, on top of us almost never seeing her in the classroom again, her whole character seemed to revolve around two things, being Kira Dream again, and him. Both of which actually represent major aspects of her childhood that she just kept going back to the point it actually became dangerous as she was hastening her and her Time Flower's death. Now with this, I was kind of thinking, or at least hoping, that she'd eventually reject the flower and realize that she had to deal with Belle not as the magical girl known as Kira Dream, but rather as the adult woman named Nozomi Umehara, showing that eventually we do have to grow beyond our childhoods and...
No, sorry, I think I might have slipped in a few clips from the original kids show that this was based on.
But no, they just used a convenient new finisher to defeat the knockoff Hedorah, and then she let the power of love from her middle school crush fix everything after she had essentially OD'd on that there pixie dust. Like, what sort of message were they even trying to get across here? That it's okay to constantly revisit your childhood, even if it does become an unhealthy habit, and then just hope things will magically fix themselves?
You realize how messed up that sounds, right?
And the thing that really gets me is how I've actually seen this sort of message about accepting adulthood told much better in actual kids shows I grew up watching.
such as the Fairly OddParents' absolutely canonical ending of Channel Chasers Piss Off, where Timmy, the boy who never wanted to grow up because he wanted to keep his magical fairies with him, did eventually accept it while still being able to look back fondly at those days even if he couldn't completely remember them. Or, as we show with that opening clip, the Kids Next Door movie Operation Zero, where Number One's father did briefly become mentally a kid again to help his son, but then willingly went back to being an adult and even destroyed a device that would have turned him back because he had other things he needed to focus on as an adult.
And I need to complete the most important mission of my life, being a good father to my son.
This movie came out just as I was graduating from high school and going to college, and while I have no plans of starting up a family of my own, it really did hit home with me because, well, like anyone else, I was a little bit hesitant about growing up. Thus, seeing shows that acknowledge the difficulties that come with growing up, and yet also highlight the hopeful aspects that also come with it, did help to alleviate some of my worries. And yes, that includes shows like Precure, including the very season this originated from, when the Yes 5 team powered down right in front of the godlike final boss of their show to assure her that they didn't need superpowers to let them move towards the uncertain future that laid ahead of them.
So that was a fucking lie.
Adding on top of that, the fact that she married Coco only further proved that Nozomi hadn't really grown beyond her middle school glory years, as not only was that more of a puppy love, but as the years have proven, they simply cannot maintain a healthy relationship, and yet because the show has to remind its viewers of those good old days, they just can't let the main character actually grow up. And that, to me, is my biggest issue with this show, and really the Precure franchise in general these days. Their inability to just let their characters, and by extension their audience, grow beyond the years when they could sell them their cheap little toys. Ever since the pandemic, Toei has seemed to have an aversion to try and do anything different with this franchise. They can claim to have the first this and that as much as they want, but ultimately, they just end up becoming window dressing to hide the fact that they really aren't that much different, and at times, I think they even seem to be taking a few steps backwards in terms of making the show for a wider audience beyond their original target demographic. We'll get more into that when we actually talk about Hirogaru Sky, but for this series that's supposedly the adult Precure show, it fails to live up to that title, in my opinion, as they ended up kind of glorifying childhood and devaluing adulthood, at least when it came to their main plot. Yes, there were a few good standalone stories with the other Cures, like Mai's and Urara, who we didn't really go over, but her and Syrup's adventure about improving their respective crafts in acting and guitar playing, and ending with admittedly a pretty awesome battle in the Internet from Our War Games, did make it my second favorite episode of the show. However, those were the exceptions and not the rule, as otherwise, it was more about the disjointed conflict with Belle obsessing over global warming, while Nozomi couldn't give up on being a superheroine, even though it was literally killing her. Neither really came off as all that endearing due to being rather one note in their respective pursuits, and more importantly, both lacked in the maturity that this show was advertising, which is a bit of an issue when it's coming from arguably the two most important characters in the show. And to be fair, while some of this was likely mandated by the NHK, especially when it came to Belle stuff, Nozomi's shortcomings seemed to be at least a bit of an active choice by Yoshimi Narita, wanting to finish the story between her and Coco, even though not a lot of people, at least who I know, were asking for it, and certainly not the way they did here. It's kind of why I'm hesitant going into Wonderful Precure, where she'll be the head writer, and I feel like she might end up needlessly slipping these sorts of tropes to the forefront again. And it's a bit of a shame that I feel this way, because in terms of at least production value, this show was better put together than Hirogaru Sky overall, though it might be unfair to compare the two due to the difference in length. But regardless, I do think it looked really good, especially some of the sequences done by Yu Yoshiyama. It's just that it kind of went to waste with this writing. Because overall, Utena Precure, in my opinion, was nothing more than another cheap cash grab for this franchise, by not only relying on a whole slew of unnecessary cameos, but also just having an inability to let go of the past. I said previously that I do fear that Precure might suffer from stagnation, and this show kind of proves my point. while there's nothing wrong with holding on to a little bit of our inner child, we also shouldn't hold them hostage and actually learn how to take the necessary steps towards the future.
Thank you for watching a slightly more cynical review, not as though we don't do that often, but still. Fortunately, the next thing we'll cover will likely be a much more positive review that will at least close out some of these Precure reviews on a high note. Yeah, for 2024, we're going to try to cover a wider range of anime beyond just this one magical girl franchise. So, do look forward to it. Until then though, for now my friends, and if you'll excuse me, I think I'm just gonna go watch the actual adult Precure show.